The children's shoes were arranged by size near the root cellar entrance, all 7 pairs, carefully lined up as if waiting for their owners to return. But the Darnell family only had 2 daughters, and one of them had been missing since October. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The mountain fog settled thick over Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in the autumn of 1897, the kind that made even familiar paths treacherous and turned neighbor against neighbor in the isolation it bred. In these highlands, where settlements clung to ridges and valleys like desperate fingers gripping stone, families lived weeks away from proper law enforcement, and justice often came down to who told the most convincing story at the general store. Luther Darnell's cabin sat at the end of a logging road that had been carved into the mountainside 3 years earlier, when the timber companies first discovered the virgin forests that blanketed these slopes. His property bordered land that had changed hands twice in recent memory, sold under circumstances that the locals whispered about, but never investigated too closely. The cabin itself was well built, constructed from chestnut logs that would outlast most of the marriages in the county, with a stone foundation that spoke to permanence, even as the world around it seemed increasingly temporary. Eliza Darnell turned 17 that September, on a day when the leaves had just begun their transformation from summer green to the gold and crimson that would briefly make these mountains beautiful before winter stripped them bare. She was tall for a mountain girl, with dark hair that she wore in a practical braid and hands that showed the calluses of someone who understood that survival here meant constant work. Her mother, Margaret, often remarked that Eliza had been born with an old soul, the kind of child who observed more than she spoke, and who seemed to carry the weight of unspoken knowledge in her careful gray eyes. The younger daughter, Prudence, had just turned 12. Where Eliza was quiet and watchful, Prudence possessed the kind of energy that made her ill-suited for the confined spaces of mountain life. She talked to the chickens as if they were confidants, named the barn cats after characters from the few books that made their way up to the settlement, and pestered her older sister with questions about everything, from why the sky changed colors to whether the dead could really watch over the living. Luther worked the timber lines, part of the crew that marked trees for the company men who decided which stands would fall and which would be spared for another season. It was dangerous work that paid better than subsistence farming, but came with its own costs. Men lost fingers to saw blades, were crushed when trees fell wrong, or simply disappeared into the woods during storms, and were found weeks later if they were found at all. The work changed men too, made them harder in ways that their wives recognized but rarely spoke about, at least not where others could hear. On the morning of October 14th, Eliza left the cabin to gather herbs that grew near the creek that marked the eastern boundary of their property. Margaret was rendering lard in the kitchen, a process that filled the cabin with smoke and smell and made outdoor tasks suddenly seem appealing. Prudence had been enlisted to help, her complaints about the boring work echoing off the log walls as her mother patiently explained that survival meant doing things that weren't entertaining. Eliza took her gathering basket, the one her grandmother had woven from white oak splits before consumption claimed her 3 winters back. She wore her everyday dress, gray homespun that had been mended at the hem twice already, and her oldest shawl, the one that no longer mattered if it caught on brambles or got stained with plant sap. She told her mother she would be back before the sun reached its peak, a promise as routine as breathing in a household where being late meant worry and search parties, and sometimes worse news. The sun did reach its peak. It crossed the sky and began its descent toward the ridgeline. Margaret called for her daughter until her voice went hoarse, the sound echoing off the mountains and returning empty. Prudence ran to the creek, to the herb patches, to every place she knew her sister favored, but found only the basket, overturned near a stand of yellow root, its contents scattered as if dropped suddenly. When Luther returned from the timberlines that evening, his face showed something that Margaret had learned to recognize over their 18 years of marriage. Not surprise, not the shock of a father learning his daughter had vanished. Something else, something that made her step back from him, even as he demanded to know what had happened, where she had looked, why she hadn't sent Prudence to fetch him immediately. The search began the next morning. 3 men from neighboring properties joined Luther in combing the mountainside, their calls echoing through valleys where anything could disappear and never be found. The timber company sent 2 men as well, more out of obligation than genuine concern, and they returned before noon, claiming they had other responsibilities. By the 3rd day, the search had dwindled to Luther alone, and by the 4th day, even he stayed close to the cabin, telling anyone who asked that Eliza had clearly run off, probably with one of the traveling peddlers who passed through selling tin goods and empty promises. The story took hold because it was easier than the alternatives. Mountain families had seen daughters leave before, drawn by the promise of cities and lives that didn't involve endless labor and early graves. The fact that Eliza had never mentioned wanting to leave, that she had left behind all her possessions, including the locket her grandmother had given her, that she had abandoned her sister without a word of goodbye. These details were noted, but not dwelt upon. People in Greenbrier County had learned that sometimes you had to accept the stories you were given, even when they didn't quite fit the facts. Margaret stopped speaking much after that first week. She continued her work, the cooking and cleaning and mending that kept a household running, but moved through these tasks like someone walking through deep water, her movements slow and effortful. She avoided the root cellar entirely, asking Prudence to fetch what they needed from its dim interior. And when Luther spent hours down there in the evenings, she found reasons to be in the farthest corners of the cabin. Prudence noticed things that the adults seemed determined not to see. The way her father had burned Eliza's gathering basket rather than keeping it, despite the fact that such baskets took months to weave properly. The new padlock on the root cellar door when there had never been a lock there before. The way her mother's hands shook when she handled the dishes that Eliza had used, as if the simple ceramic carried some terrible weight. But most of all, Prudence noticed the way the mountain itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to break the terrible silence that had settled over their hollow. The birds that usually filled the mornings with song had grown quiet. The wind that normally rushed through the pines carried an edge that made even warm days feel cold. And at night, when the darkness pressed against the cabin windows like something solid and alive, Prudence thought she could hear her sister's voice carried on currents of air that had no earthly source. The neighbors stopped asking after Eliza by the end of October. The timber company continued its work, the sound of axes and saws providing a rhythmic backdrop to days that stretched into weeks. Winter approached with the inevitability of all mountain seasons, and the Darnell family prepared for it with the same grim efficiency they brought to all their tasks. 3 people living in a space built for 4, the absence more present than any ghost could be. But absence was not the same as gone. And in the mountains of West Virginia, where the land held secrets as old as the stones themselves, some disappearances refused to stay silent. The question was not whether the truth would surface, but what form it would take when it finally clawed its way back into the light. The nightmares began on the first night of November, 1897, exactly 3 weeks after Eliza's disappearance. Prudence woke screaming, her voice cutting through the cabin's darkness with such force that both parents stumbled from their bed in the small room they occupied at the far end of the dwelling. Margaret reached her daughter first, finding the girl sitting upright in the narrow cot she had once shared with her sister, eyes wide and fixed on the window that faced the eastern woods. Prudence was trembling, her nightgown soaked with perspiration, despite the chill that had settled into the mountains with autumn's progression. "She was standing right there," Prudence whispered, pointing toward the window with a shaking hand. "Eliza was standing in the yard, just beyond the fence line. She was trying to tell me something, Mama. Her mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear the words." Luther stood in the doorway, his bulk blocking what little moonlight filtered through from the main room. His voice came harsh in the darkness. "It was a dream, girl, nothing more. Your sister ran off, and you need to accept that fact and stop this foolishness." But Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest as she looked at her younger daughter's face. This was not the expression of a child waking from an ordinary nightmare. Prudence's gaze held a clarity that spoke of something witnessed rather than imagined, and her certainty carried a weight that mere dreams could not produce. The second occurrence came 3 nights later. This time, Prudence did not scream. Instead, Margaret woke to find her daughter standing at the window, perfectly still, her breath fogging the glass as she stared into the night. When Margaret approached, Prudence spoke without turning. "She wants me to look under the oak tree, the big one by the property line. She keeps pointing at it." Margaret pulled her daughter away from the window, her own heart hammering against her ribs. The oak tree Prudence described was ancient, its trunk wider than 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder, its branches spreading like gnarled fingers against the sky. It marked the northwest corner of their land, a boundary that had stood for longer than any living person could remember. The third visitation came during daylight, and this time Margaret witnessed it herself. She was hanging laundry behind the cabin, securing the damp sheets to the line with wooden pins, when she heard Prudence gasp. Turning, she saw her daughter frozen near the woodpile, staring toward the tree line with that same expression of focused attention. "Mama, do you see her?" Prudence's voice carried a strange mix of hope and terror. "She's right there, by the birch trees. She's wearing her blue Sunday dress." Margaret looked where her daughter pointed and saw nothing but bare branches and the brown carpet of fallen leaves. Yet something made her skin prickle. Some instinct that told her the space her daughter indicated held significance, even if her own eyes could not perceive it. The air there seemed somehow denser, as if reality had folded in upon itself in a way that defied natural explanation. Reverend Thaddeus Kinney arrived on the following Sunday, making his monthly circuit through the mountain settlements. He was a thin man whose education had come from a seminary in Charleston, and he carried with him an air of civilized certainty that often clashed with the practical superstitions of his mountain congregation. When Margaret approached him after the service, held in the lumber company's largest storage barn, he listened with the patient expression of someone accustomed to hearing grief manifest in various forms. "The mind plays tricks when we lose someone dear to us," he explained, his voice gentle but firm. "Young Prudence is experiencing what we might call manifestations of her sorrow. She misses her sister, and so she creates these visions as a way of maintaining connection. It's quite common, actually, particularly among the young. But that night, the Reverend agreed to visit the Darnell cabin, more out of pastoral duty than genuine belief in supernatural occurrence. He brought his Bible and his certainty, prepared to offer comfort through prayer and rational explanation. What happened instead would shake that certainty to its foundations. As they gathered in the main room, Prudence suddenly stood and walked to the door, moving with the purposeful stride of someone following instructions only she could hear. She opened it without hesitation and pointed into the darkness beyond. "She says there are 7, Prudence announced, her voice strange and distant. 7 who never left these mountains. 7 whose families were told lies, and she was going to prove it before he stopped her." The Reverend opened his mouth to speak, to offer some theological framework for what he was witnessing, but the words died unspoken. Because there, on the doorstep where no one had placed them, sat Eliza's hair ribbons, the blue ones she had worn on Sundays, arranged in a pattern that could not have occurred naturally. 7 ribbons, laid out like a message in a language only the dead could write. Luther's face drained of color. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, and Reverend Kinney, for all his education and certainty, found himself confronting the possibility that the boundary between the living and the dead was far more permeable than his theology had prepared him to accept. Prudence stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, and whispered to the darkness beyond, "I'm listening, Eliza. I promise I'm listening." The diary surfaced in 1943, discovered by a county historian named Vera Sutton, who was cataloging materials donated to the newly established Greenbrier Historical Society. It had been tucked inside a wooden box of miscellaneous documents, its leather cover water-stained and cracked, the pages yellowed but still legible. The handwriting identified it immediately as belonging to a young woman, the script careful and deliberate despite the disturbing content it contained. Eliza Darnell had begun keeping the diary in July of 1897, 3 months before her disappearance. The early entries documented ordinary mountain life, weather patterns, garden harvests, visits from neighbors, and her mother's recurring headaches that seemed to worsen with each passing season. But by late August, the tone shifted dramatically. "Father came home from the timberlines with mud on his boots that doesn't match our property," one entry read, dated August 23rd. "The clay here runs red with iron, but his boots carried black soil, the kind that only comes from the lowlands near Droop Mountain. He claimed they were working a new section, but the company roster shows no crews assigned to that area. I checked when Mr. Hostetler visited last week." Subsequent entries revealed a pattern of observation that spoke to Eliza's methodical nature. She noted times her father left the cabin at unusual hours, always claiming timber work, despite returning with no sawdust on his clothes. She documented conversations overheard between Luther and men who visited after dark, their voices low and urgent, speaking of the arrangement and keeping things quiet, and what happened to the Yost family. The Yost family reference appeared multiple times. Through careful inquiry, disguised as casual conversation, Eliza had learned that the Yosts had owned prime timberland adjacent to the Darnell property. They had vanished in 1894, their cabin found abandoned with breakfast still on the table. The land had been seized for unpaid taxes and sold at auction, purchased by a holding company that immediately resold it to the timber operation at 3 times the price. "Mama knows something," Eliza wrote on September 7th. "I found her crying in the root cellar this morning. When I asked what troubled her, she grabbed my hand so tight it hurt, and begged me not to ask questions about Father's business. She said some truths are too dangerous for young women to carry. But how can I unknow what I've already learned? The entries detailed other disappearances that locals had attributed to typical mountain hazards. The Kincaid brothers, who had refused to sell their mineral rights. The widow Fenwick, who had witnessed something she mentioned to the county clerk before falling to her death from a cliff she had climbed successfully for 40 years. A traveling preacher who had spoken too loudly about corruption in the timber industry. Each incident shared common elements: valuable land or inconvenient testimony, followed by convenient tragedy, followed by property transfers that benefited the same network of men. And Luther Darnell's name appeared in connection with each one, never overtly, but present like a shadow at the edge of the narrative. The most damning entry came from October 9th, 5 days before Eliza vanished. I found the ledger in Father's trunk, hidden beneath his winter clothes. It documents payments made to 7 men, including Deputy Marsh and County Clerk Tipton. The amounts correspond exactly to dates when properties changed hands after their owners died or disappeared. There are notes in the margins, instructions about making things look natural, about ensuring no witnesses remain. I made careful copies of 3 pages before returning it exactly as I found it. The entry continued with chilling prescience. I showed the copies to Mama tonight, after Father left for one of his meetings. She went pale and told me I must burn them immediately, that possessing such information would get us all killed. She said Father had been threatened into this arrangement, that he had no choice after they learned about his debts from the failed harvest of '92. She begged me to forget what I'd seen. The final entry was dated October 13th, the day before Eliza disappeared. I cannot burn the evidence. 7 families destroyed, perhaps more, and no one held accountable, because the very men who should enforce justice are complicit in these crimes. I've hidden the copies where they'll be found if something happens to me. Tomorrow, I'll speak with Reverend Kinney when he passes through. He's an educated man, with connections in Charleston. Perhaps he can help me understand what to do with this terrible knowledge. But Eliza never made it to that conversation, and the copies she mentioned hiding were never found, at least not in 1943, when Vera Sutton discovered the diary. What the historian did find, tucked into the diary's back pages, was a hand-drawn map of the Darnell property, with 7 X marks scattered across it, and a note in Eliza's careful script, "Where truth lies buried." The objects began appearing in late November of 1897, always in places where they had no business being, always positioned with deliberate care that ruled out accident or natural occurrence. The first was Eliza's tortoiseshell comb, the expensive one their grandmother had brought from her own mother's house in Virginia. Prudence found it balanced on the gatepost at dawn, positioned upright as if someone had placed it there moments before. The comb had been in Eliza's room the day she disappeared, tucked in the small wooden box where she kept her few precious belongings. Luther had locked that room after the first week, forbidding anyone from entering. Margaret's hands trembled when Prudence brought the comb inside. "You took this from your sister's room," she accused, but her voice lacked conviction. They both knew the door remained locked, the key hanging from Luther's belt, even while he slept. "It was on the gatepost, Mama. I swear it." 3 days later, Prudence discovered Eliza's Sunday shawl draped across the split rail fence that bordered their vegetable garden. The fabric showed no signs of weather damage despite weeks of mountain storms. More disturbing, the shawl had been folded with precise corners and laid out as if displayed for inspection, pointing directly toward the northwest corner of their property, where the ancient oak tree stood. Luther burned the shawl that evening, feeding it to the kitchen fire, while Margaret protested weakly and Prudence watched in silent fury. But burning objects did not stop them from appearing. The stone arrangements came next. Prudence woke one morning to find 7 smooth creek stones positioned in a line, leading from the cabin door toward the woods. Each stone was identical in size, clearly selected with purpose, and they traced a path that led directly to a spot 20 yards into the tree line where the soil showed signs of recent disturbance. When Luther saw them, something crossed his face that Prudence had learned to recognize as fear, poorly disguised as anger. He kicked the stones aside and ordered Prudence to stop her cruel games, but they both knew she had not placed them there. The girl had been locked in the cabin with her parents all night, the bar across the door preventing entry or exit until morning. December brought more discoveries, each one revealing fragments of information that accumulated like pieces of a puzzle assembled by invisible hands. Eliza's schoolbook appeared wedged in the fork of a tree, opened to a page about geological surveys and mineral deposits. A strip of fabric torn from her everyday dress hung from a branch near the property's eastern boundary, marking a spot where Luther had forbidden the family from walking. Most significant were the bark carvings Prudence found on 3 separate trees that formed a triangle encompassing nearly an acre. Someone had carefully etched symbols into the wood, arrows pointing downward, X marks, and what appeared to be initials. The carvings were fresh, despite weeks of weather, the exposed wood still pale and sap-sticky. Prudence began keeping her own record, drawing maps that charted each discovery's location. Patterns emerged. Every object, every marking, every stone arrangement pointed toward specific areas of their property. And always, they led back to 7 distinct locations, including the massive oak tree that dominated the northwest corner. On Christmas Eve, the most chilling discovery appeared. Prudence found her sister's locket, the one containing a lock of their grandmother's hair, hanging from a low branch directly above a patch of ground where nothing grew despite the surrounding vegetation. The locket's chain had been carefully tied in a bow, and inside, tucked beside the hair, was a tiny rolled paper. Prudence's fingers shook as she unrolled it. The paper contained 7 names written in Eliza's unmistakable script: Yost, Kincaid, Fenwick, Brewster, Harding, Darnell. The final name struck Prudence like a physical blow. Her own family name, listed among what she now understood were victims. But which Darnell? Surely not Eliza herself, though the terrible implication hung in the air like smoke. Or perhaps it referred to someone else entirely, someone whose absence had never been properly explained. That night, Prudence confronted her mother while Luther was away at one of his mysterious evening meetings. She laid out everything she had found, every object and marking, and demanded the truth. Margaret's resolve finally crumbled. She pulled her daughter close and whispered the confession she had been carrying like a stone around her neck. Your sister discovered terrible things about your father's business with the timber company. She told me she had proof, documents that showed how people died so land could be stolen. She wanted to take that proof to authorities in Charleston. Margaret's voice broke. The night before she vanished, your father confronted her. I heard them arguing in the root cellar. She told him she would not stay silent while innocent people suffered. And then, the older woman could not finish, but she did not need to. Prudence understood. The objects appearing around their property were not random hauntings. They were clues, carefully placed guideposts leading toward evidence that Eliza had hidden, before confronting their father. Her sister was speaking from beyond death, using the only method available to her, directing Prudence toward the proof that could finally expose the truth. Armed with her mother's partial confession and the pattern of clues Eliza had left behind, Prudence began her own investigation in January of 1898. She started where her sister had started, with careful observation and strategic questions disguised as innocent curiosity. The general store in the nearest settlement served as the social hub where information flowed more freely than the whiskey kept hidden beneath the counter. Prudence accompanied her mother on supply runs, listening while men gathered around the stove, discussed timber contracts and land transfers. She learned to recognize names: Deputy Elwood Marsh, who seemed remarkably unconcerned about unsolved disappearances; County Clerk Raymond Tipton, whose signature appeared on every suspicious property deed; timber boss Augustus Vance, whose company had accumulated thousands of acres through remarkably convenient circumstances. At the post office, Prudence befriended the postmaster's daughter, a talkative girl named Opal, who loved gossip more than discretion. Through carefully guided conversations, Prudence learned that certain letters never reached their destinations. Complaints sent to Charleston about timber company practices mysteriously vanished. Families attempting to contest land seizures found their correspondence disappearing before responses could arrive. "My pa says some things aren't meant to be talked about," Opal confided one February afternoon. "Says there's men in this county who decide what's true and what isn't, and going against them is how people end up at the bottom of ravines." The pattern became clearer with each piece of information Prudence gathered. The conspiracy extended beyond simple theft. It was a system, carefully maintained by men who held every position of authority in the county. Deputy Marsh investigated crimes selectively, closing cases before real inquiry could begin. Clerk Tipton controlled all official records, ensuring documents told whatever story served the conspiracy's interests. The timber company provided money and motivation, while local business owners who benefited from the company's presence maintained strategic silence. Prudence discovered that Reverend Kinney, despite his education and outsider status, had been warned explicitly about involving himself in local affairs. A traveling judge, who had questioned suspicious deaths in 1895, had been reassigned to a different circuit after his horse threw him under circumstances witnesses found difficult to explain. Most chilling was learning about the Harding family, whose name had appeared on Eliza's list. Jacob Harding had operated a competing timber survey, documenting old-growth forests with plans to propose conservation measures in Charleston. His entire family had perished when their cabin burned in the winter of 1896. The fire was ruled accidental, despite neighbors reporting they had smelled kerosene, despite the fact that all exits had somehow been blocked from outside, despite Jacob's survey notes never being recovered from the ashes. By March, Prudence understood what Eliza had discovered and why it had cost her sister's life. This was not simply about land or money. It was about a complete corruption of every system meant to protect mountain families from exploitation. The very people settlers should have trusted had instead become predators, using their positions to facilitate crimes they were supposed to prevent. And Luther Darnell, her own father, had been pulled into this network through debt and threats, becoming complicit in horrors he might have initially resisted, but ultimately enabled. The question remaining was whether he had simply looked away while others committed violence, or whether his hands carried more direct guilt. Prudence knew the answer lay buried where Eliza's clues had been pointing all along. The 7 locations marked by mysterious appearances corresponded to 7 names on her sister's list. 7 families destroyed, 7 secrets the mountain was being forced to keep. It was time to stop collecting information and start digging for proof. Circuit Judge Nathaniel Hargrove arrived in Greenbrier County in April of 1899. 18 months after Eliza's disappearance, he was a methodical man from Wheeling, appointed by the state to review land disputes that had accumulated in the mountain counties. Prudence had been waiting for someone like him, someone outside the local power structure, someone who might actually listen. She approached him after he concluded a hearing at the lumber company's office, carrying a leather satchel that contained everything she had documented over the past year. Maps showing the 7 marked locations on their property, the list of names in Eliza's handwriting, copies of property transfers that showed impossible timing, testimonies from 3 families willing to speak quietly about relatives who had vanished after refusing timber company demands. Judge Hargrove listened with the careful attention of a man trained to evaluate evidence. When Prudence finished her presentation, he asked a single question that cut to the heart of the matter. Why would your sister mark these specific locations unless something was buried there? The excavation began 2 weeks later, despite fierce opposition from Luther and urgent visits from Deputy Marsh suggesting the judge was overstepping his jurisdiction. Hargrove brought workers from outside the county, men who owed no loyalty to the local power structure. He started with the massive oak tree, the location Eliza's clues had pointed to most persistently. They found her on the 3rd day of digging, 6 feet below the oak's roots. The remains were wrapped in canvas, buried with a care that suggested someone had possessed enough conscience to provide decent interment, even while committing terrible wrong. Personal items confirmed identity: the blue Sunday dress, her grandmother's wedding ring, the small Bible with her name inscribed inside the cover. Margaret collapsed when they brought news to the cabin. Luther sat in silence, his face carved from stone, offering no reaction and no explanation. Prudence felt something break inside her chest, grief and vindication warring with each other until she could barely breathe. But Judge Hargrove's investigation hit immediate obstacles. The county coroner, a man who served at Deputy Marsh's pleasure, examined the remains and declared the cause of death impossible to determine due to decomposition. He suggested an accident, perhaps a fall, with burial conducted by a panicked father who feared being blamed. No mention of evidence suggesting otherwise. No inquiry into why an innocent man would choose concealment over seeking help. When Hargrove pressed for a more thorough examination, he discovered that crucial documents had gone missing from the county clerk's office, property records that might have established motive, correspondence that could have revealed the conspiracy's scope. Even some of the evidence Prudence had submitted mysteriously vanished from the locked room where the judge had stored it. The case was being undermined from within by the same network of complicity that had enabled the original crimes. And Luther Darnell, watching the investigation stumble toward inevitable compromise, began to believe he might escape with nothing more than a charge of improper burial. He had not counted on his wife's breaking point finally arriving, or on the power of a mother's guilt to overcome a lifetime of enforced silence. Margaret Darnell walked into Judge Hargrove's temporary chambers on the morning of May 16, 1899, without telling her husband where she was going. She had spent the previous night in prayer, or what passed for prayer, when faith had been corroded by years of complicit silence. By dawn, she had made her decision. The judge dismissed his clerk and closed the door. What followed was 3 hours of testimony that would be recorded in court documents as the most damning evidence against Luther Darnell. even as it failed to touch the broader conspiracy that had orchestrated multiple tragedies. Margaret spoke in a voice so quiet, the court stenographer had to lean forward to catch every word. She described the night of October 14th, 1897, when Luther had returned home earlier than expected, his face carrying an expression she had learned to fear. He had gone directly to the root cellar, where Eliza had been reviewing the documents she had copied from his hidden ledger. "I heard them arguing," Margaret testified. "Eliza told him she knew about the Yost family, about the Kincaids, about all of them. She said she had proof, copies she had made, and that she intended to take them to authorities in Charleston. She told him he could come with her, turn witness against the others, perhaps find redemption through honesty." Luther's response had been to rage about the debt that had forced him into the conspiracy's grip. The failed harvest of 1892 had left them desperate, vulnerable to the timber company's offers of money in exchange for cooperation. He had agreed to alter survey reports, to provide false testimony about property boundaries, to sign documents without reading them carefully. Each compromise had led to deeper entanglement, until he became not just complicit, but essential to the conspiracy's operation. "He told her she was naive, that she didn't understand how the world worked," Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face. "He said the men involved would eliminate anyone who threatened to expose them, that her proof would only get all of us killed. Eliza told him that staying silent while others suffered was its own kind of death." The argument had escalated. Luther had tried to seize the documents Eliza held, but she had fought back, telling him they were not in the cellar, that she had already hidden them where he would never find them. In his fury and panic, Luther had shoved his daughter. She had fallen against the stone foundation wall. Margaret's voice broke completely as she described rushing down to find Eliza unconscious, blood seeping from a wound on the back of her head. Luther had checked for breathing, for heartbeat, his hands shaking as he realized what he had done. By the time Margaret reached her daughter's side, it was already too late. "He buried her that same night," Margaret whispered. "Made me swear I would tell no one, threatened that if I spoke, we would all be destroyed by the conspiracy. He said they would make it look like I had done it, that Prudence would be taken by the state, that our family would be erased just like the others." The testimony established Luther's guilt beyond question, but Judge Hargrove immediately recognized its limitations. Margaret's account proved Luther had caused Eliza's death, but it did not provide the broader evidence needed to prosecute the conspiracy itself. The documents Eliza had copied remained hidden, and without them, the network of corruption would survive untouched. Luther Darnell was arrested that afternoon. As deputies led him away, he looked at his wife with something that might have been hatred, or might have been gratitude, that she had protected the secrets he had been too weak to resist. The trial would come, but justice would prove as compromised as everything else in Greenbrier County. The trial of Luther Darnell began on July 12, 1900, in a courthouse that had seen justice dispensed selectively for decades. Judge Hargrove presided, but his authority was constrained by a system designed to protect its own. The jury consisted of 12 men, 8 of whom had business ties to the timber company or owed debts to men within the conspiracy's network. The prosecution was handled by District Attorney Vernon Sutcliffe, a competent lawyer who understood immediately that he was expected to secure a conviction, while carefully avoiding any testimony that might implicate powerful individuals beyond the defendant. His opening statement promised justice for Eliza Darnell, while simultaneously framing her death as a tragic family dispute, rather than the silencing of a witness to systematic criminal enterprise. Margaret's testimony formed the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She repeated what she had told Judge Hargrove, describing the argument, the violence, the burial conducted in darkness and panic. Defense attorney Marcus Thorne, retained by the timber company, ostensibly as an act of charity toward a former employee, did not challenge the basic facts. Instead, he built his defense around Luther's state of mind. This was a father driven to desperation, Thorne argued. A man who had made mistakes, certainly, but who acted in a moment of uncontrollable passion when confronted by his daughter's reckless accusations and threats to destroy the family's livelihood. What happened was tragedy, not premeditated malice. The defense called witnesses who testified to Luther's good character, his regular church attendance before the incident, his reputation as a steady worker. They spoke of the financial pressures facing mountain families, the impossible choices men faced when debt threatened to consume everything they had built. No one mentioned that Luther's debts had been deliberately created through predatory lending practices designed to force cooperation with the conspiracy. Prudence sat in the courtroom gallery, watching justice being carefully managed like a theatrical production. When she tried to introduce evidence about the broader pattern of deaths, about the documents Eliza had discovered, the judge sustained objection after objection. Such testimony was deemed irrelevant to the specific charge against Luther Darnell. The conspiracy would not be tried here. Deputy Marsh testified briefly, confirming that he had investigated Eliza's disappearance and found no evidence of foul play at the time. He did not mention that he had discouraged searching certain areas, that he had dismissed neighbors' concerns, that he had actively worked to ensure the case remained unsolved until Judge Hargrove's external authority forced a proper investigation. County Clerk Tipton appeared as a character witness, praising Luther's integrity in business dealings. He did not mention the falsified documents he had processed at the conspiracy's direction, or the property records he had altered to facilitate illegal land transfers. His testimony lasted 7 minutes and went unchallenged. The trial's most revealing moment came when Prosecutor Sutcliffe attempted to establish motive beyond family conflict. He began questioning whether Luther had been protecting larger interests, whether Eliza's knowledge had threatened powerful individuals who might have pressured her father to ensure silence. Defense attorney Thorne objected immediately, and Judge Hargrove, despite his private sympathies, was forced by legal precedent to sustain. Without Eliza's hidden documents, without concrete evidence linking the conspiracy to her death, such speculation was inadmissible. The law, designed to protect the innocent from baseless accusations, instead protected the guilty from deserved scrutiny. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, their verdict reflected the careful choreography that had defined the entire proceeding. Luther Darnell was found guilty not of murder, but of manslaughter. The judge, bound by sentencing guidelines and aware of the pressures being applied from multiple directions, imposed a sentence of 3 years in the state penitentiary. 3 years for a life. 3 years for silencing a witness to crimes that had destroyed multiple families. 3 years for being the weakest link in a chain of corruption that extended from mountain hollows to county offices to the state capitol itself. As guards led Luther from the courtroom, he looked toward Prudence one final time. What she saw in his face was not remorse for what he had done to Eliza, but relief that the trial had concluded without exposing the full scope of what he knew. He would serve his time, return to the mountains, and live out his days with the protection of men who valued his continued silence. Prudence understood then that courtroom justice would never be sufficient. The legal system had been captured by the same forces that had orchestrated the crimes it was meant to punish. true accountability would require something beyond lawyers and judges and carefully managed testimony. It would require finding what Eliza had died protecting, the documented proof that could withstand the corruption of official channels, evidence so compelling that even a compromised system could not ignore it. The final visitation came on the night of September 3rd, 1900, exactly 3 years after Eliza had begun documenting the conspiracy in her diary. Prudence, now 15 years old, had spent the summer working through her grief and rage, knowing that legal justice had failed, but unable to accept that failure as final. She woke that night to find her room filled with a presence that defied explanation. Not cold, as ghost stories suggested, but rather a warmth that carried the scent of the herb garden, where Eliza had spent so many hours. Prudence sat up, her heart steady despite the impossibility of what she was experiencing, and spoke into the darkness. "I'm listening. I've always been listening. Show me." What followed was not a vision in the conventional sense. Rather, Prudence experienced a series of impressions, memories that were not her own, knowledge transmitted through channels that existed outside rational understanding. She saw her sister in the weeks before her death, working methodically through the night while their parents slept, copying documents by candlelight, organizing evidence with the precision of someone who understood the stakes. The impressions guided Prudence out of the cabin, through the pre-dawn darkness, toward the eastern boundary of their property, where a massive chestnut tree had been split by lightning the previous spring. The damaged tree had seemed like just another casualty of mountain weather, but now Prudence understood it as a marker deliberately chosen because it would endure even after death. She reached the tree as the first light touched the ridgeline. The lightning strike had opened a cavity in the trunk about 6 feet up, exposing the tree's hollow interior. Prudence climbed carefully, her hands finding purchase on bark, still scarred by fire, and reached into the darkness of the cavity. Her fingers touched oilcloth, carefully wrapped and secured. She pulled it free and descended, her legs trembling not from exertion, but from the weight of what she held. As dawn spread across the valley, she unwrapped Eliza's legacy. The package contained 3 leather document folders, each one meticulously organized and labeled. The first held copies of the hidden ledger Eliza had found in Luther's trunk, showing payments made to 7 men over a span of 6 years. Each payment was dated and noted with cryptic references that Eliza had decoded in marginal annotations: property seizures, convenient deaths, falsified reports, intimidated witnesses. The second folder contained property records that Eliza had somehow obtained from the county clerk's office, showing the chain of ownership for lands that had belonged to the families on her list. Each transfer was accompanied by Eliza's careful analysis, showing how sale prices were manipulated, how taxes were suddenly imposed on properties that had been exempt for generations, how deeds were modified after being filed. The third folder was perhaps most damning: correspondence between timber company executives and local officials, discussing strategy for managing obstacles and ensuring cooperation. The letters never explicitly mentioned violence, but their meaning was clear to anyone willing to read between lines written with the assumption of absolute security from exposure. But Eliza had included something beyond documentation. She had written a comprehensive narrative, dated October 13th, 1897, the day before her death. In it, she explained her investigation, her conclusions, and her intentions. She named every person involved in the conspiracy, detailed their roles, and provided context that transformed scattered evidence into an undeniable pattern of criminal enterprise. The final page contained a message directed specifically to whoever found her work. If you are reading this, I am likely dead, and those who profited from silence have succeeded in silencing me. But evidence endures beyond individual lives. Truth, properly documented, cannot be buried as easily as bodies. Take this to authorities beyond local corruption. Demand investigation by those with no stake in maintaining convenient lies. Honor the families destroyed by greed disguised as progress. Do not let their suffering exist only as footnotes in someone else's profit ledger. Prudence sat beneath the lightning-struck tree as the sun rose fully. The documents spread across her lap, and understood the magnitude of what her sister had accomplished. Eliza had not simply gathered evidence. She had created a comprehensive case file, organized with such clarity and supported by such meticulous documentation that it could withstand the scrutiny of honest authorities. The challenge would be finding those authorities, reaching beyond the compromised local system to individuals who valued truth over convenience. Judge Hargrove had been forced to work within legal constraints that protected the conspiracy. But these documents provided grounds for federal investigation, for congressional inquiry, for the kind of external pressure that even entrenched corruption could not entirely deflect. As Prudence carefully rewrapped the folders, protecting them from moisture and damage, she felt the presence that had guided her fade like morning mist. But before it vanished entirely, she experienced one final impression: gratitude and trust, and the profound relief of a burden finally shared. Eliza had solved her own murder by ensuring the truth would outlive both her death and the systems designed to conceal it. Prudence Darnell did not immediately take the documents to authorities. She understood, as her sister had understood, that timing and strategy mattered as much as evidence itself. Rushing forward with explosive revelations would give the conspiracy time to destroy corroborating records, intimidate potential witnesses, and construct defensive narratives. Instead, she spent the autumn of 1900 making careful copies of everything Eliza had compiled, storing duplicates in 3 separate locations beyond Greenbrier County's borders. She contacted Judge Hargrove first, presenting him with the evidence during a private meeting in Charleston. The judge, who had been forced to watch justice compromised in his own courtroom, recognized immediately what Eliza's documentation represented. He began building a case file that would eventually reach the federal district attorney's office, framing the conspiracy as interstate commerce fraud rather than local criminal enterprise, thus establishing federal jurisdiction that local officials could not obstruct. By spring of 1901, the investigation had expanded beyond what the conspiracy could contain. Federal marshals arrived in Greenbrier County with warrants for Deputy Marsh, County Clerk Tipton, and 4 timber company executives. The arrests triggered a cascade of testimony from men desperate to reduce their own culpability by implicating others. The network that had seemed impenetrable crumbled as self-interest overcame loyalty. Luther Darnell, serving the final months of his inadequate sentence, was offered immunity in exchange for complete testimony about the conspiracy's operations. He declined, choosing silence over redemption, and died in prison 6 months before his scheduled release, his heart failing in a way that some whispered was not entirely natural. The timber fraud trials stretched through 1902 and into 1903, resulting in 14 convictions and prison sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. Property seized through fraud was returned to surviving family members or their heirs. The timber company was dissolved, its assets liquidated to provide compensation to victims. It was justice, delayed and imperfect, but real nonetheless. Margaret Darnell lived quietly for another decade, never remarrying. maintaining her late husband's cabin until her death in 1913. She left everything to Prudence, including a letter that acknowledged her own cowardice and begged forgiveness for years of protective silence that had protected only guilt. Prudence herself never married. She became a schoolteacher, educating mountain children about the importance of documentation, evidence, and speaking truth, even when silence seemed safer. She kept Eliza's original documents, adding to them over the years as more information about the conspiracy's full scope emerged. In 1947, 50 years after Eliza's death, Prudence donated the entire collection to the newly established Greenbrier County Historical Society. The archival materials filled 3 large boxes and included not just the evidence that had broken the conspiracy, but also Eliza's diary, correspondence with Judge Hargrove, trial, transcripts, and Prudence's own extensive notes documenting her investigation. The historian who processed the donation, Vera Sutton, recognized immediately that she was handling something extraordinary. Here was a complete record of how one young woman's methodical courage had exposed systematic corruption, how documentation had proved more powerful than violence, how truth could outlive both its authors and its opponents. The Greenbrier Historical Society's archive became a research destination for scholars studying Appalachian history, timber industry abuses, and the role of individual integrity in confronting institutional corruption. Eliza Darnell's story was included in textbooks, referenced in legal cases about corporate responsibility, and taught in ethics courses at universities across the country. But perhaps the most fitting memorial came in 1973, when the state of West Virginia established a historical marker near the site of the old Darnell cabin, long since collapsed into foundation stones and memories. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Eliza Darnell, 1880 to 1897, whose courage in documenting truth led to the exposure of the Greenbrier timber conspiracy and brought justice to families denied it for too long. Her legacy reminds us that one voice, speaking truth with evidence and conviction, can outlast any attempt to silence it." The marker stands today, visited by those who understand that the most powerful hauntings are not supernatural but historical. The persistent presence of unresolved injustice and the enduring power of those who refuse to let truth remain buried. Eliza Darnell solved her own murder not through ghostly revenge, but through meticulous preparation and trust that evidence would find its voice even when hers was taken. She understood that documentation is testimony that survives death. The truth properly preserved cannot be intimidated into silence, and that courage takes many forms, including the patient work of building cases that will outlive their builders. In the mountains of West Virginia, where fog still settles thick and families still tell stories of the old days, Eliza's name is remembered not as a victim, but as an investigator who proved that even the most vulnerable among us can hold the powerful accountable if we have the wisdom to document what we discover and the faith that someone will eventually listen. The curse of 1897 was not supernatural. It was the curse of corruption that feeds on silence, and it was broken by a 17-year-old girl who understood that the best way to speak from beyond the grave is to leave behind words that cannot be disputed, evidence that cannot be ignored, and truth that refuses to stay buried no matter how deep the grave. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that individual courage matters and that documentation is power, show your support by hitting that like button. And if you want more stories that illuminate the hidden corners of history, where ordinary people did extraordinary things. Subscribe to join our community of truth seekers, because the most important stories are often the ones someone tried to erase. Let's make sure they're never forgotten.